Welcome to This Medical Life podcast. These are the stories of medicine with Steve Davis and Dr. Travis Brown. This is the story of steroids and testosterone, part 2. Dr. Travis Brown, have you ever been tempted to bulk your muscles up with a foreign substance?
No. Look, when I was serious about my sport, I used to look at all the supplements. I loved sports medicine. You get all the books and everything. I was never interested in anything injectable or the hormonal treatment. But you try all the sort of creatinine, all the supplements type stuff. And whether they work or not is always sort of still debatable. But no, probably because I sort of knew a little bit too much about the side effects of it, and I was just not interested. But I can understand people who want to get the edge, want to sort of push themselves, or just want to get really big, and looking at it. And this is where, it's interesting. Anabolic steroids is part of that. It is actually part of the gym culture. And so if you talk to people at gym, you can actually tell people know who, are taking, just because it's pretty obvious that someone's bulked up in, a short amount of time. And this was the understanding of sort of anabolic steroids. And the amazing thing is how recent anabolic steroids is. It's actually started in about World War II. And this is where they started doing experiments on it was actually to try and help wounded soldiers, treating wounded soldiers. This was patients who had had weight loss and muscle wasting, and they thought, well, maybe testosterone will help them. Maybe this will help aid in trauma recovery. And so they tried it on actually various amounts of patients. Does it help patients with depression, fatigue, low morale? Will testosterone boost them up in that area? And the amazing thing that I found fascinating is steroids really came into use in the Cold War. And this was because this is when pretty much it was political ideology, and the differences could come through that my athletes from my country and my political persuasion are stronger than yours. We are better physical. And again, coming out of World War II, where you've got all the, racism that came in through that about who was weaker and who was lesser. And you can see that, well, our athletes are better than your athletes was sort of almost the de facto kind of.
So part 1 of this series was a literal peeing contest. This is a figurative one.
Oh, this is, I'm superior, my race or my culture is superior to your race, and we're going to beat you. And this was the fight for physical dominance. And this was, the best stage for this was the Olympics.
There will be 71 nations at the Olympics at Helsinki. The United States would like to beat all of them, but the only one that counts is Soviet Russia. The communist propaganda machine must be silenced, so there can't be even one distorted bleat out of it in regard to the Olympics. In sports, the Red Brothers have reached the put up or shut up stage. Let's shut them up. Let's support the United States Olympic team.
And so that's from New York Times. And that's the amazing thing. That was going into the 1950s. You sort of beat the Reds. And again, I'm sure the Soviets were the same. And this was about the fight for supremacy. And in 1952, the Olympics, if you look at it, it was the US ended up getting a total of 76 medals. There were 40 gold. And the USSR got 71 medals and 22 gold. And so in the tally of everything, the USA had a close victory with, all the tallies, not just medals, but, who got 4th, 5th and 6th. There's a whole numerical kind of thing. So the US won closely. So they were the superior nation. And so in 1956 in the Melbourne Olympics, it switches. And so the USSR then goes up to 98 total medals. They have 37 gold, with the USA having 74 medals and 32 gold. And so from that, in the space of 4 years, USSR has gone from being inferior to the United States to becoming superior. And so we know now that this was heavily involved in a state-sponsored steroid use. And athletes, successful athletes at the time, they were given, from the USSR, they were given privileges. They were given gifts, cars, apartments, state stipends, increase in salaries. They had ability to travel. And so by the 1960s, this was pretty much well known that the USSR had to be doping. Like, that might be part of, so like, we're losing, so therefore they have to be cheating. But we do know they were actually using, and steroids, amazingly, at the time, were not banned. Like, it wasn't until 1976 that they were actually banned. But it's interesting enough, things like alcohol and caffeine were banned. And there was a Swedish pentathlete, Hans Gunnar, who was banned because he had a few beers before he competed and sort of detected alcohol in the 1968.
If I was his competitor, I'd say, no, have your beer.
Yeah, you would think so. But again, that's one of those things. And so the amazing part was the USSR and the USA competing, but the most notable country who actually did it was in the 1970s and 1980s, and that was state-sponsored steroids used by the East Germans. And so the East Germans ended up having the second medal tally in 1988 in the Seoul Olympics. To the US they lost. And so this is, if you look at it, the USSR at the time had a population of around 230 million. The USSR had a population of about 260 million. East Germans had a population of 16 to 17 million. And so we now know that there's a program called System 14.25. And this is not just state-sponsored, this is state-sanctioned steroids use. They had over 10,000 athletes taking a drug called OT, which is oral turinabol. And it's this involved the secret police, the East German secret police called the Stasi. And the Stasi had over 3,000 moles in their sports program, so they were keeping an eye on people who were competing and athletes. They had scientists, coaches, athletes, and not only that, they actually you had athletes reporting on coaches, coaches reporting on athletes as well. And it was just, they knew that this oral steroid increased muscle mass and reduced recovery time. And so they were able to go through, and not only did that, they targeted children, and because children as young as 12 years old, not only do they target children, they targeted women, because women would actually have a far greater response from anabolic steroids than males. And so they could actually increase the women's ability, performance time, far greater than they could the men. And so they ended up having massive amount of side effects. It was masculinization. They had the female athletes, East German athletes, had male-type hair growth, deepening voice. They suffered from depression. They got amenorrhea, so they stopped having their periods. Even in long term, they started having problems with miscarriages, liver disease, heart disease, premature death. And amazingly, in all this, in 1988, none of the East German athletes tested positive for anabolic steroids. And so that's what happens when you have state-sponsored or state-sanctioned steroids, is they knew how to avoid the detection systems. And so this is why we're looking at anabolic steroids. We know a phenomenal amount, probably from the last half century to century now, about patients, about their side effects, and how we look after them. And so this is why we're sort of looking at this, because again, a lot of people are actually using this in a recreational setting as a sort of performance enhancer, but also an image enhancer. And so we're just trying to learn more about it.
Don't make me angry. Dr. Tim Piatkowski is a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Queensland and an internationally recognised leader in lived experience-led research on image and performance-enhancing drugs. His work bridges consumer and clinical perspectives and has led to pioneering changes in health service delivery and drug policy. Tim is our guest on This Medical Life podcast. Tim, welcome. And I wonder if we could start by asking you, how common is steroid use in Australia?
Recent estimates worldwide, and these, mind you, are from a colleague of mine in 2014. We know that on average about 3.3% of people in the world have tried steroids. So if you extrapolate that to Australians, you're looking at about 800,000 people. Now, we don't have very good surveillance systems or prevalence systems here. Nowhere in the world actually does, to be honest. And so our available surveys, like the National Drug Household Survey, really doesn't seem to capture it well. The number fluctuates and changes. For example, in 2016, it was 0.9% of the population. And then somehow in the most recent one in 2024, it was 0.2% of the population again. And that is co-occurring with other factors like, for example, the fact that we've had over the last decade about 1,400% increase in the weight of steroid seizures that we see at our Australian border. And we have seen people who use image and performance-enhancing drugs jump from somewhere in the remit of 7% representation at our needle exchanges to closer to about 30%. And in some areas, half of their clientele are now image and performance-enhancing drug user consumers. So I know we can't, conflate those measures with prevalence, but certainly from what it looks like, we probably need to take a bit more care in terms of how we capture this in future.
If we were to compare Australia to the rest of the world, how would our usage? Are we sort of in the average, or do you think we're elevated or less?
Let's consider, I guess, what is conducive to a steroid using environment, right? And I think people use these substances for a variety of reasons. Obviously, you mentioned hypogonadism before, so we're talking strictly here, or not strictly, but most of the time non-medical use, so off-label, right? And so when people use androgens and other enhancement drugs, they're generally motivated to use them in a particular way. And most commonly, that's aesthetics or performance, so increasing strength, also for confidence, well-being, feeling youthful, sexual enhancement, so to increase sex drive. And so I guess where are the environments that's most conducive? I mean, for me in Queensland, we have a lot of sun, we have a lot of surf. We have beautiful beaches, and so I think somewhere like the Gold Coast, we know that at least at one of the services I partner with, Queensland Injectors Health Network, at Burleigh Heads, iPads are like the number one thing that people come to the exchange for. So it used to be, but most of our country, it used to be heroin, and then it switched to methamphetamine. But now, a very, very solid position for equipment provision for that. And again, not conflating that with prevalence, but I think it's still a strong indicator of what our population is doing and what they're interested in. And so, if we look at other places like perhaps Brazil, or our friends in the United Kingdom, we got two different stories. Brazil, very, very conducive to looking a particular way. Plastic surgery is quite common. They actually, medical professionals, physicians over there prescribe and support patients, including women, in off-label androgen use. And so there's quite a few studies out of there looking at, I guess, the benefits of that on people's health and social outcomes, as well as, I guess, economic outcomes in terms of less, surprise health events and other things occurring. And then you look at our friends in the UK, not so many, I'm not trying, respectfully, probably not so many nice beaches, not so much conducive weather, but they do also have, a similar, I'm going to call it a public health issue in terms of off-label androgen use, the representation in needle exchanges. And I think over there, They operate on a Class C framework, so decriminalized androgens, and but still not embedded in terms of public health or health promotion. And coming back to us, despite having the right environment, everything else, I think highly criminalized. In Queensland, you can go to jail for 25 years for possessing steroids. Never heard it happen to anyone, but the threat's there, right? And so, pardon me. And so I think coming back to your original question, like even despite like the differences, we criminalize steroids and other enhancement drugs pretty heavily, but we still are probably one of the world leaders in terms of this. And just to back it up with a little bit of data, I guess over the last 10 years globally, the EMDCCA, the European drug monitoring guys, found that globally there was an increase of about 700% in iPad seizures, so federal police seizures. And as I said earlier, we're at 1,400%. So we are world leading in something.
This is not a fully formed question. It's an observation. As you were speaking, it just occurred to me that I was at gym this morning doing a circuit, and it was called the Big Ripper, this one, and there was a cartoon image of a big red kangaroo, completely muscles bulging. Perhaps could you just reflect on that sort of imagery, which I didn't really put two and I just, because I'm not that ripped. Is that part of this, the culture? Does this set people up? Is it tapping into what's already there? Does it help breed a drawing towards a need to idealize this kind of body type?
When we, I guess, consider those motivations, so body image being one of those, we have that, Western body ideal, like the kangaroo, except human, I guess. And, there's a few things that feed into that. I guess Kevin Thompson came up with a model in 1997 and colleagues called the tripartite model. And that speaks to how parents, peers, and family, and it's been extended obviously since then and applied to men, not just women, but how those sociocultural pressures feed into body image comparisons and body image internalization. And those things convert to body dissatisfaction, which converts to bulimia, or in the original model, anorexia and bulimia, but in other models, like the ones in my research, convert to things like drive for muscularity or risky body enhancement behaviors like steroid use. So 100%, I think it's no longer that you have to buy a specific magazine. It's long gone that you have to pick up a specific magazine. You just pick up your phone and it's there on any social media platform. And that's got to be having an effect on particularly young people, but everyone.
I don't want to sort of stereotype people, but do we know who is actually who's taking steroids?
I guess from some etiological studies, again, there's one sort of global one that I'm thinking of by Sago and colleagues, generally initiating between 18 and 30, under 30, generally men or young boys, generally motivated by those things I mentioned earlier, although I think generally the top motivations are probably aesthetic and performance, especially for that younger group. And from, I guess, some of the other work that's looked at clustering or like latent class analysis, so trying to separate these profiles into groups, Christensen sort of came up with this typology for men who use these drugs non-medically. And there were 4 typologies from memory. There's one that was the athlete type, one that was the well-being type, one that was the expert type, and my personal favorite was the YOLO type, like you only live once.
Yes.
And so I think those are, again, loosely represent what I was speaking about earlier, and the ages would obviously fluctuate around that.
Is there any theories as to why steroids is increasing?
I wish I could say it was increasing because then that would make everything easier. Look, I mean, so I've managed to do it once. So between the meta-regression in 2014, I published a systematic review about 2 years ago and showed that between those times, women's steroid use, lifetime steroid use, has gone up to 4%. So that sort of inferred an increase from the last systematic review to mine. Um, and I did point towards a few factors like driving that. And these aren't isolated to women particularly, but I think it comes back to what you were saying, Steve, around, ripped
Yeah.
pictures of, everything is bigger and more shredded. And I mean, Harrison Pope did a study all the way back in 1997 where he compared the sizes of action figures from like the 1960s all the way up through to the 1990s. And he extrapolated the size of the arms and waist and the ratios. And I think one of the Wolverine figures there had like 34-inch like biceps. Like I don't think even Ronnie Coleman or any of the like biggest, Mr. Olympia competitors, I think at most they were at 30 or 31.
Right.
So this thing was humanly, out of range at that point. And fast forward to now, what are we? Almost 30 years later. And I think it's just progressively gotten worse. So just bombarding people with these sorts of images, and I think a lack of transparency. Like, I'm very much for like health promotion or health communication messaging, or even any messaging. But I guess just like tell people what's actually going on. Don't say that you're you built this body on exercise and diet, and not mention the other ingredient, because that is terribly confusing for young people, especially.
Is there any guidelines on how people are to take steroids? Like, is there information out there for people to say, oh, this is how to take it safely?
So I think one of the things my program really tries to do, and it's because I guess enhancing drug communities do this so well. Let's go back. So I think in terms of this group particularly, we talk about lived experience and community knowledge. Here, I guess the common term coined by Lee Monahan in the 90s was ethnopharmacology. It's like a folk science or folk medicine. And I think that pretty aptly describes what's happened in this community. It's the peer transmission of knowledge, I guess with a lack of medical oversight or interest during those times. And so people in these communities have really come up with, I guess, experimenting, testing, trying, and doing what they could. And that's sort of evolved over, 40, 50 years really, really well. And I guess I, a few years ago, coined ethnopharmacological connoisseurship. Like we have, situated knowledge among communities that almost represents like, being a connoisseur of sorts in terms of drugs. And I guess through that, as we've sort of, I guess, evolved, the digital age has come, transmission of information has become instantaneous. People are, really, really communicating on online forums, not just in the gym, reading academic papers, making contact with researchers, medical professionals are getting involved. There's this real triangulation of as many factors as possible, but that always seems to be outstripped, to be honest, by people in community. They are so far ahead of the curve in terms of what they're doing, even though perhaps there's not an explanation there yet, or or it hasn't come out like generally. And so, coming back, what's the guidelines? I mean, as someone who's used, androgens and other enhancement drugs in their life, I guess long time ago, I think the recommendation on the forum, on internet forums, like Reddit or like, whatever else, was, 500 milligrams a week of testosterone and anthate, and you do that for 12 weeks, and then you run post-cycle therapy, and then you stop using for 12 weeks, and start from there, all the way up to, you know, 3 grams of whatever, and just beginner, intermediate, and advanced, cycles. I think what's happened is that people have, moved towards exploring, I guess, why you're using these drugs, what they do in the body, all those types of things. And so I think, to be perfectly honest, some people have moved to probably closer to like clinical models. So, for example, we know that, for our hypogonadic friends, or for people who are undergoing gender transition, 100 milligrams a week of testosterone is there at the top end. And in some studies, they push them up to 250. But people have, I guess my impression is that people have started aligning themselves more closely with those models, aligning themselves more closely with, I guess, we call them human drugs or bioidentical hormones. So things like drostanolone, or methanolone, nandrolone, obviously not being that, being very, very much like a performance steroid. But I guess, starting to think more closely about using vet drugs like boldenone or trenbolone, or, any sorts of designer pro hormones or designer steroids like Superdrol or anything like that. And alongside that, there's been this huge boom in development in terms of, other options. So our peptide markets have exploded, and we've got, growth hormone, but we've also got growth hormone releasing peptide 2, 6, 9. We've got ipmorelin. We've got all these recovery peptides as well now. And I think people have really started trying to modulate more than just tipping more androgens in. And there's been starting to be a lot more engagement from, I guess, medical professionals, more clinical literature, and trying to marry all of those things together. It's a long walk for a short glass of water, Travis, but I think what's the guidelines? I guess there's the guidelines for what we do clinically, and then there's people that are pushing that up a little bit, while trying not to die.
Yes, good point. I'd love to know internally what Dr. Travis Brown and our esteemed medical practitioners listening in think about this ethnopharmacology. What role do you think podcasters like and authors like Tim Ferriss and the others who have been quite public in monitoring and sharing their blood count, their this, their that, they're trying this and this gram, does that give us normal lay people a false sense of bravado in this field, or does it actually, do you feel, generally make people a bit more chastened and want to look for evidence-based approaches? And you don't have to answer that if that's going to get you into trouble.
No, I think a little bit of all of it, right? Like, that cultural piece is great. Like, as I said earlier, it's about building awareness. There's IFBB pros out there who are very open about their use, and but frame it as this is not the be all and end all. Like, there's lots of other parts to this puzzle, and there's also a lot of sacrifices. I think when it comes to the health effects that come from enhancement drugs, there's a real issue in terms of framing those health effects for people. If I told you, okay, let's go and inject some heroin right now. We'll do that intravenously, somewhere, and I'll say to you, but just be mindful, there's a risk right now that you might overdose and die. I can't help you because I'm doing that myself. I'm busy doing this. So are you happy to take that risk on board? And I think for steroids, you don't overdose necessarily. I mean, insulin is a different non-medical insulin use, different story. And I guess that's within the remit of what we're talking about, but it's still different. I'm not going to administer testosterone subcutaneously or intramuscularly and die anytime soon. But we do know that left ventricular hypertrophy is a huge reason why people have cardiac issues, as well as atherosclerotic plaques, et cetera, et cetera. But let's focus on just one. That doesn't happen overnight. We know that growth occurs, and we can monitor that remodeling as it happens. But suddenly people might go into heart failure, and this has been bubbling under the surface because we haven't actually been monitoring that happen. One of my colleagues, Nick Weir, had this issue occur, was monitoring all of his bloods, and wasn't doing echoes, and suddenly went into heart failure and had to be flown back to Australia. And ejection fraction's probably still sitting under just over 30, but still clinically in heart failure at the moment. Now, that could happen in 10 years, could happen in 1 year, could happen in 20, could happen in 30, but it's a hard sell for health promotion and risk management, saying, well, what's going to happen to me? Oh, probably nothing, like right now. Or, my bloods look great and I'm fine. We don't actually know. And so I guess playing devil's advocate in both ways, I'm very, very supportive of transparency and open health communication. I think that's excellent. But also, I guess, what about the undesirable or unintended consequences of that promotion or that false sense of safety? So I think when I say transparency, I mean presenting a really fulsome risk profile to people, and telling an entire story, not just part of it or, my story in particular.
Is there much discussion about the negative or harmful or even possible long-term effects that you just mentioned? Is that just said as something that's in passing, sort of the disclaimer at the end of gambling advertisements? It's just sort of that no one actually listens to. But is there much discussion about that, those kind of effects?
I think so. I think yes and no, because every PED educator is, presenting a little waiver at the end saying, I'm not a doctor and, this is not medical advice and blah, 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 blah. But like you said, it's a gambling ad or a drinking ad. No one cares. And everyone just wants to hear about how much trenbolone to blast before, anything happens, or how to get, 30-inch arms as quick as I can, or how to looks max, or whatever else we're doing at the moment, right? But I think there is this turn towards, like I said, people presenting the entire story and saying, look, I used drug XYZ, and this is all the positive things that happen, and these are all the, to me, negative things that happen. We see a lot of it around trenbolone, the veterinary drug, so originally designed for cattle as an implant pellet, and then bodybuilders in the 80s were grinding down Finaplex, so the actual tablets, and then injecting that. And that's what trenbolone acetate was. Now, obviously, we just import powders from China, and people are either pre-manufacturing or manufacturing here. But I guess we know that in terms of any other steroid, and I guess I've got a program of work looking at trenbolone specifically. But I guess milligram per milligram, the potency, the neurotoxicity, the genetic changes, at least from what we can extrapolate from animal models. They use a lot of zebrafish. And I know we're different to zebrafish, but I guess some of the data is pretty disturbing, like in terms of, apoptosis and other like forced copulation, other things like that. And you'll see it all over the internet as well. People will say, oh yeah, trenbolone, divorce in a bottle, ruined my life, all these types of things. And so there's this whole story around, this particular type of steroid. But it's promoted a lot of openness. Unfortunately, what it's promoted as well is that there's 15-year-olds approaching coaches that I know, at least locally, asking specifically for Trenbolone. Because, if it's that bad, imagine what it could do for my gains. Imagine what it could do for me, in terms of the positive effects. And so, I think it gets super complicated when we look at what do we present? How do we present, health communication? What do we, how do we encourage safer use? How do we move towards cessation? How do we encourage prevention? It actually gets really, really tricky.
You've given me a new nightmare fear. My fear is swimming and meeting a shark. Now it's meeting a ripped zebrafish.
Just on that though, looking at the other side, so coming from the doctor's perspective, let's assume you have a patient that comes into you who's not clearly using, but you suspect is potentially using. Now, my understanding is that person's potentially not interested in us saying, well, you really shouldn't, and having the finger wag. But what is the best approach for a doctor who is with a patient who may be honest or may not be honest about using? What's the sort of, I guess, what are they looking for that kind of interaction?
Yeah, I really love this question. And I wrote a paper specifically on this in 2022, where I spoke to a number of healthcare providers, as well as people who use enhancement drugs. I think, look, the stigma is the big one. As soon as I guess people feel judged or stigmatized, like with any other community of people who uses drugs, I think there's immediately a lack of engagement, like a barrier to entry, inability to take on information critically. Basically, everything goes out the window. So I think overcoming like that is speaks to building a good therapeutic relationship, and it's immediately trying to approach it. We're trying to approach the situation and the person without that judgment or stigma, engaging in, generally what they're looking for is just some health monitoring, and, some looking at those reference ranges and seeing how things are going, prescribing, sending them for an echo, or any other, tests. Generally, and I don't want to, be too broad and sweeping, but I think this is a cohort that is usually quite happy to, engage really well in their health and also to pay for their health, and for their health to be good. Now, that said, just want to make a point that there are also people who are, on public benefits and using steroids and, need the Medicare rebate, and bulk billing and all of those things. So, but I think as well, you've got a group that really wants to engage in their health. You've got a critical touch point of general practitioners and other medical professionals that just aren't engaging and haven't done so for quite some time. I think there's a real opportunity there. Unfortunately, I guess what most healthcare providers or medical doctors have expressed to me is that it's a real vacuum in general training. And so in terms of our Royal College, there's no sort of specified information. I mean, I've been part of like continued education programs with, endocrinologists and other people where we do deliver specific training, but I don't think that gets out there enough. I think there's, also doctors many times mention that tricky ethical, moral, legal boundary. And as you probably know, testosterone prescribing has been curbed about 4 times in the last 20 years for us, as well as the changes in terms of clinical cutoffs, etc. I think for prescribing, that's a whole different story, and that's a real health policy or drug policy piece, something that I'm really interested in working on. But I think before we even get there, the first stage is making sure that everyone's ready to engage, monitor, and have a good partnership there, and expectations need to be set on both sides, I guess. But I think, coming back to really practical tools like engaging without judgment, being able to provide health monitoring around blood pressure, around reference ranges. I think prescribing is, something that we should, really open up to in the future. But I think at the moment that's not a conversation anyone's ready for yet. Be really, really good, I guess, if we could look at what pharmacotherapies for off-label androgen use would look like, and if we could treat it a little bit more, I guess, like other programs we have, like OAT, or anything like that, because I guess we know that people who use drugs get far better health outcomes when they're supported, and I guess, yeah, training and education, resourcing, things like what you're doing, the cultural awareness piece,
Yep.
is really, really important as well.
There's just very quickly, just finally, is there many guidelines as to, like, when people are at their end of their steroid journey, when looking to come off steroids? Is there any guidelines on, I guess, how to quit or how to come off them, as, I guess, to reduce their sort of negative sort of side effects of withdrawing?
One of my colleagues, Beng Yu, has done a set of GP guidelines in partnership with New South Wales Health, I believe. Now, Beng runs a clinic down in Prahran, in Victoria, and does have an influx of this patient group seeing him, does some research in the space as well. As far as like official guidelines, I guess that's as close as we get. And there's some recommendations in there. At the moment, I guess I've been doing a little bit of work in this space with the general practitioner clinical unit at the University of Queensland. And so we're looking at, I guess, number one, scoping out what cessation and recovery looks like around the world and what evidence we have, and moving towards looking at clinical guidelines for cessation and recovery, along with some partners in the US, Canada, and the UK. And those are places where we do have clinical guidelines that are, I guess, supported and endorsed. I think on that as well, there's been only my colleagues in Norway have run one small trial around post-cycle therapy drugs, so things like clomiphene, and I think that had a lot of issues with participants. So the other thing that I think we really need, and I'd really like to see, and something we're working towards, like I said, pharmacotherapies, rather than talking about post-cycle therapy or anything like that. Pharmacotherapies for cessation and recovery. I think trials. How much clomiphene do we give people? How long, afterwards? Do we give them tamoxifen? What about HCG? How much? Are there any other things that we can use? Because in community, there's a lot of recovery protocols there. A lot of people, who are ready to have children or who want to stop for any other reason. There's lots of options for them. I guess, wouldn't it be lovely if they could walk into a practice and sort of have that there? Because I guess the other issue here is that if you want to stop, well, number one, you're not engaging with health professionals, that's for sure. You're ordering your substances online. And I guess that's where another big program of my work is Roid Check, where we check those unregulated substances and report results to people, and give them a health intervention. But, you're ordering stuff that you don't know what's in there. Like, my work's shown that 70% of those products are underdosed, almost 3/4. 1 in 6, wrong drug. You got something else in there. So maybe you're ordering HCG or Clomid for recovery. Maybe you're getting brick dust or who knows what. You're following a protocol online that's, not validated and not reliable, except perhaps used by Roger, 34, man from the US. And, you also may or may not be able to get some monitoring through your local health professional. You might use an online provider like, Roid Safe or iMedical or iScreen. And then you might have a coach who's not a medical professional. But I don't say that in that they're not qualified. They might have been doing this for 30 years. But all those things come together and, what do you end with? I guess don't know, depends on a whole constellation of factors and things coming together. And that can be really, really sad for people and can perpetuate, I guess, now clinical hypergonadism that they're going to have to live with, and a whole host of other, poor health and social outcomes.
I can see a systematic literature review of the alternative groups is going to be in order at some point. Tim, just in closing, do you have any final thoughts or advice to doctors or patients about using or quitting steroids? What's your parting words?
Yeah. I think really, really glad that you're doing a whole segment on this. I think it's, again, that cultural piece of raising awareness and trying to build in engagement, education and training for both sides. And then also obviously encouraging, people who do use enhancement drugs to, feel safe and supported in that. But I think that's a parallel sort of piece of work. But things like this are the first steps towards that.
Dr. Tim Piatkowski, thanks for being part of This Medical Life.
Thanks, guys.
Dr. Maya Underwood, PhD, Anthropology, is a senior lecturer in the School of Social Science at the University of Queensland and an anthropologist of the body. She studies bodies not just from the usual biomedical perspective, which dominates understandings of the body in our society, but rather from a social and cultural perspective. That is, she studies what bodies mean, how people experience their bodies, and the things that people do to their bodies. Now, while she's studied various body modifications in the past, her recent research has focused on bodybuilding cultures, and in particular online communities of bodybuilders who use image and performance-enhancing drugs. She's conducted online ethnographic research, that is, with participant observation, in these communities for more than 7 years and is a recognised expert on the knowledge and practices of enhanced bodybuilders. Maya is our guest on This Medical Life podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for taking an interest in my research.
My pleasure, and I will just say for the record, I know you're looking at me and thinking this guy's bulked out. This is all natural, Maya, just for the record.
Oh, well, that's good, because we do have a problem with these fake natties that, claiming natural. When guys are as big as buff as you,
yeah,
we need to be told so that we don't end up permanently dissatisfied.
There you go. So let's get underway seriously. Look, from your experience, Maya, where do people who use steroids go to for advice, and who do they trust?
Well, they trust each other. They go to each other for information, and I'll tell you what I've learned about why that is. Now, bear with me because this is going to be a slightly lengthy answer, but it's going to set the scene for our discussion today. So there's a really long history of disconnect between people who use image and performance-enhancing drugs and the medical and scientific communities. And there are a variety of reasons for this. For a start, there was the fact that some in the medical and scientific communities denied that steroids, anabolic androgenic steroids, worked. Up until as late as the turn of the century, would you believe, there were still some medicos was saying, no, these steroids don't build muscle. And meanwhile, bodybuilders have for decades, for like half a century, been using these drugs to great effect. So they're looking at these medicos going, well, what do they know? And, meanwhile, bodybuilders are publishing little publications about how to use these drugs, how to reduce the harms of them. And medicine is still pretty ignorant. So there's one reason is that's part of the reason. There's also some academics publishing in medical fields that have exacerbated divides by taking quite a moralistic stance on image and performance-enhancing drug use and spreading misinformation about these drugs, like academics perpetuated the myth that the Nazis used steroids to increase the aggressiveness of their soldiers. It's not true, but numerous academics repeated this myth. Other forms of misinformation that have been spread by members of the medical and scientific communities are things like overstatements of the harms of these drugs. Now, I'm not saying that these drugs are harmless, not by any stretch of the imagination, but often medicos will overstate the harms of these drugs and give unsupported health warnings. So again, it contributes to the impression that the medical establishment is not to be trusted. They stigmatise us and they don't really know anything. So why would we listen to them? And I mean, the unfortunate reality is that the medical establishment knows very little about these drugs and how to reduce the harms of them. Obviously, when research is done, it's usually in a therapeutic context. It's not in an enhancement context. So when these drugs that bodybuilders use have been studied, it's to correct for deficiencies. They're used in very different doses. They're not combined in the same way that bodybuilders use them. There's no medical benefit to understanding how to get jacked, beyond reestablishing muscle that's, atrophied or something beyond a therapeutic context. We don't really need to understand the building of hypermuscularity. So there's no research that explores what steroid users do, really. And the research to inform harm reduction for these drugs is very, very limited. And so professionals really lack an evidence base to talk from. As professionals, you need to have your perspective backed up by the science. There isn't the science. So what can you say? And as a result, the professional focus for image and performance enhancing drug harm reduction has sort of been inappropriate. They've emphasized things because they don't really understand the issue of steroid use. They don't understand the harms and how these drugs are managed. They've just latched onto things that they know, which is bloodborne virus. This is what we do with drug users, is we talk about bloodborne virus. And when it comes to other recreational drugs, it makes a lot of sense. There's needle sharing. It's a big risk. But with steroids, there isn't the psychoactive component. There isn't the addictive component in the same way as there is with other drugs. So there isn't the desperation. There's no real need to share needles. Most of the use I observed was quite systematic and considered. There's no rush to inject, so why would you share needles? So while bloodborne virus is an issue for any injecting drug user, and there is some issues around it with steroid use, it's much lower sort of on the list of priorities for steroid harm reduction than it might be for other recreational drugs. So people who use steroids and other image and performance enhancing drugs want help with the things that they see as much more important, like potential for organ damage, hormonal imbalances, hematocrit levels, these sort of things. And sometimes they can actually resent the focus on bloodborne virus. It's like you're grouping us with the junkies. And you don't understand how we're different. So there's all of these reasons, plus when people that use these drugs go to doctors, often the doctors know less than they do themselves about the drugs because they often do their research online. So they're having to actually educate doctors. Obviously the quality of the information they get online can vary hugely, but they find that often when they do go to doctors and they do divulge this, which is a risk because of the legality in most countries, they're not actually getting anything useful. The GPs, the endocrinologists don't have the information that they're seeking. So for all of these reasons, they have developed their own knowledge, what we call the bro science of image and performance enhancing drugs. They've done all of these N=1 studies, and then they come together and they compare results and they discuss them. And some of them are coaches, so they have several people that they're observing. Okay, if I give this drug with and these ancillaries, this is what happens. They get their blood work done. They post that online too and ask each other for opinions. And they've built the body of knowledge, the bro science of steroids, which is much more complex and sophisticated than the professional understanding of these drugs. So, and you know, some of these bro scientists, you know, don't know much. Others have PhDs in relevant disciplines and have very sophisticated knowledge. So we've got professionals on the one hand that have very limited knowledge and no science to really work from. And then we've got these guys, mostly guys and girls, who have built this system of knowledge for decades. And there's a near complete disconnect between these two bodies of knowledge. So what my work is to try and bridge this disconnect. So I'm really grateful for people like you, Steve and Travis, having me on the show so that I can speak for the people that use these drugs to people who could have a real impact on their lives and health.
When someone's starting to use or interested in using, how hard is it to them to get the bro science? Because I would have thought, are these easy forums to find out the information? Are they sort of, or is it, you know, you have to earn your stripes to sort of get into the online forum that is the, you know, massive, I guess, sort of build? Is this information shared freely amongst users themselves, or is this something that almost like a hierarchy? No, you're not serious and, you know, go away type thing.
No, there's absolutely no filters on the amount of information you can get. I mean, you can just go on YouTube. Anyone can go on YouTube. A lot of my research was done in, you know, publicly available parts of the internet. Yes, there are closed steroid forums that you join and your membership, you know, you earn seniority in membership, and there is some hierarchy within those communities, but the information is made freely available, and it's kind of, you know, cultural capital in these communities that if you can talk in about these issues, and especially if you can sound sciencey, because that's a big thing in these communities now. The old sort of meme in these communities that would, if you were going to dismiss someone's knowledge in a forum, you would look at their profile pic and see how big they are, and then you'd say, "Bro, do you even lift?" And that was the way of dismissing them. Now it's shifted. Since around the turn of the century, there's been this real emphasis on the science. And now the meme is, "Bro, do you even science?" So you need the language, and some of them use it in a very sophisticated manner, have huge amounts of knowledge. Others just sound sciencey. And I get the suspicion that they absolutely know nothing. They've picked up a few big words that they throw around, and that's enough, combined with a half-decent body, to convince people to listen to them. So the information is freely available, but it's of varying quality, and the viewership, I don't believe, from my experience, has the ability to judge what is good information and what is bad information. And I mean, I'm a social scientist. I'm not a medico. I can't tell you if insulin combined with growth hormone and this is what that's going to do. You know, so yeah, it's a minefield for someone who's thinking of using. It's a minefield out there because not only have you got varying quality of information, but a lot of these guys have body image problems. So although they're collecting this information, they are probably ignoring certain things that they don't want to see, emphasizing the bits that they do want to see, because they need to justify continuing in this vein because their identity and their self-image is wrapped up in it. We need people like you guys who can come with a more disconnected and objective perspective to help people negotiate this sort of information.
Now, you mentioned two drugs there, which again, insulin and growth hormone. Is what kind of medications and drugs are people sort of looking for or seeking or trying to get access to?
Yeah. Well, look, most of you would be when it comes to image and performance enhancing drugs, and I tend to call them image and performance enhancing drugs rather than performance and image, because most of these drugs are used for image these days. It's not for performance. Most of these drugs are used by recreational bodybuilders. So people who are building muscle, no intention on competing or anything, just to look good, shirtless on the beach, or something like that. The most common of these image and performance enhancing drugs that you all would have heard of are the anabolic androgenic steroids, testosterone, nandrolone, stanozolol, trenbolone. All of these are the sort of base of pretty much all image and performance enhancing drugs. Oral or injectable anabolic androgenic steroid will be the base of the sort of regime. And then there are the ancillary drugs to deal with the effects of the steroids. So to deal with things like estrogen levels, and to try and maintain natural production and things. So they might be using some tamoxifen, some HCG, things like this. So there's usually there's the steroids, which there may be several of. Then there's the ancillary drugs, which there may be several of. And then they're the other image, they're the fat burners, because obviously bodybuilding is not just about the muscle. It's about reducing the fat so that the muscle is clearly visible. So you've got the fat burners and stuff, the clenbuterol, DNP, Ozempic, all of these things, anything that they can use to create this body, they will use. So experimental things, they will do the experiments on themselves. This is the bro science of it. So we've got the steroids, the fat burners, the ancillary drugs, and for anyone who's followed bodybuilding, you would have seen a change in about the 1990s. Like we had Arnie and stuff before. They're big guys, but they had this sort of aesthetics to their physique. And then in the 1990s, they just became monstrous. And they just became this like walking X. The thighs became massive as well, and the bodies just became more monstrous. It's the era of what we call the mass monsters. And what changed then was the drug use. It went from just steroids and sort of fat burners and stuff to human growth hormone and insulin. So that addition allowed this whole nother level of muscularity to be achieved, to get these ridiculous sort of comic book proportions that you see at the top levels of bodybuilding today. So that's the sort of suite of drugs that I saw. It can be extremely complex, these protocols.
Today's far more connected than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Like I was surprised to hear tamoxifen mentioned in there, sort of just how are people getting access to these drugs, and is it easy to get access?
Yeah, from what I gather, it's very easy to get anything online. So it used to be that to be an enhanced bodybuilder, you had to have a friendly vet or someone that you got your drugs from. And they still use some veterinary steroids like trenbolone, is potentially very problematic but very effective a drug that they use, a veterinary drug. So it used to be more restricted. You needed a friendly vet or you needed some dude at the gym who could sell you this stuff. Now, all you got to do is go online. And it seems to be easy because I was offered steroids at least half a dozen times during the research. I must have been visiting forums and places where my details were picked up and people were sending me emails. Would you like, usually from China, we've got cheap steroid raw stuff, for sale. And so I would get approached without even looking. So what's happened is that the Chinese market for raw products has opened up in about the 1990s, turn of the century, and things have exploded. So anyone, and it's apparently quite simple, one of my participants described the process, quite simple, to make steroids for sale from raw product. So there's lots of backyard labs all over the place. Obviously, the quality is variable. The cleanliness of these labs can be variable. And, variable quality, they do test their own gear. There's labs that you can send your gear off and find out what you're actually using. There's labs where you can request blood work to monitor your health and things like this, so you can sort of see, is it having the impact? Is it actually that drug? Because it should be doing this. These are serious issues, especially for women who might be aiming to use a certain steroid that's less androgenic because of the virilization process that can come with using steroids. And if they're not actually getting the compound that they ordered, but some other compound that is more androgenic, then that can have a significant and permanent effect on them.
Is there any groups of people that you were surprised taking these groups of drugs?
Well, see, I worked in enhanced bodybuilding communities. That was my project focus, because I knew that's where most of these drugs were used. So I just hung out in Facebook groups, steroid forums, watched YouTube videos, read comments, this sort of stuff. So I was mainly focused on a particular part of the steroid using community, the biggest part, and it was mainly men. But what did surprise me was the number of men who had no intention of competing in bodybuilding or, in any sport that were using them. It was a lot of them. And what really, really surprised me was that you often couldn't tell that they were using steroids. When I was doing the ethics for my research, I was really worried that if they were coming to my office, that people would know I was doing steroid research and this big monstrous man's walking up to my door, that they've sort of lost their confidentiality and privacy because it's going to be obvious that this is a steroid user. What astounded me was that the majority of the steroid users that I spoke to weren't that big. They're not all Arnie-sized guys. They're just often just trying to get to a reasonable size that is the ideal in our society, and they just want to get there quicker. They're not aiming for monstrosity. Some of them are. But yeah, I was surprised at how many steroid users could be walking among us and go, oh yeah, he's a pretty well-built guy, but you wouldn't go, that guy's on steroids. So that surprised me, that so many women face the risks that they do using these drugs surprises me. I can understand why they do. It's a very, there's risk to use when you're male, but when you're female, there's whole other levels of risk involved. But yeah, as I said, I only really worked in bodybuilding communities, so I didn't really come across people who were using for different reasons. Or
Maya, what you've just shared, is that part of the reason why you lead with body image and performance with body image first? Because you're seeing that that's just, in inverted commas, and I don't mean to load this, but tasteful use just to get an aesthetic outcome, to deal with a psychologically based reflection of oneself first, and performance is a smaller subset?
Well, for bodybuilders, performance isn't really a thing. Even in the sport of bodybuilding, and some people will debate whether it's a sport, because most of the effort is done before the event. You're not actually doing anything. I shouldn't say that. You're posing, and posing is a skill. I couldn't do it. You have to learn how to pose. But it's not really about a performance as much as it is about the sort of work that you've done behind the scenes. And there are other sports that are similar.
Actually, it's like the analogy of art. The artist has done all the painting, and so the competition is the hanging up of the art for its,
Yeah, so bodybuilding is kind of like that. So it's not usually about the numbers you lift. And in fact, if you're training for strength, it's a different style of training and a different style of steroid use than if you're training for hypertrophy, for the big muscles. What astounded me, and I still don't quite understand it because I'm a social scientist and this isn't really my training, but you can have big muscles and not be as strong as the guy with the smaller muscles. Because of the different styles of training. I don't really understand how that works at a physiological level, but it does. So I call them image and performance enhancing drugs because most of these drugs are used for image. Yep. Some are used by athletes for performance. In bodybuilding, I don't think most people know that if it doesn't have natural in the title of the competition or the federation, these people are on steroids. It's just part of the sport. You cannot be Mr. Olympia, Mr. Universe or whatever and be natural. You just wouldn't be competitive. In fact, some would say you can't get to those levels now without using human growth hormone and insulin as well as steroids. So you have these natural federations and natural competitions for people who supposedly don't want to use steroids. But what I've heard is that just means you use steroids up until a certain date, then you stop using them so they can't be detected. So even those, it's debate over how natural that is. So people don't really understand how much steroid use happens. One thing I'm going to write a paper on at the moment is people don't understand what a steroid body looks like. So they don't understand that, when men get to a certain age, their testosterone levels drop. If they are that jacked, there is absolutely no way that they're natural. They don't have a clue of which of our celebrities are natural or not. I don't know if you saw the Liver King fiasco that happened, I think it was last year, where he was outed by a YouTuber. He was an influencer and he sold supplements. His thing was eating raw animal organs, which is why he was the Liver King. And he made heaps of money selling supplements from these organs and claiming that his body was the result of this diet, this primal way of living, right? And then he was outed by a YouTuber, an email between him and his coach talking about his steroid and other, I think it was insulin and other stuff in there as well, protocol. And no one in the bodybuilding community was surprised because this guy is a beast. He's huge. But everyone outside of the bodybuilding community went, he lied to us? It's like they have no idea what is achievable naturally and what is a steroid body. So I have a personal sort of mission to change this because a lot of, especially young men, look up to these guys who are claiming that they're natural and they try and be like them and they never get there and they live in this constant state of dissatisfaction and shame because they feel like they're failing because they're using the supplements the guy said and they don't look like the guy. But they have no idea that they're never going to look like the guy. My son said, "Can you drop me at the movies?" I said, "Oh, what are you seeing?" And it was a movie with a certain former wrestler, shall we say. And I said, "You can only go see this movie if you tell all your mates that he's not natural." And he did. And all his mates went, "Really? He uses steroids?" And they had no idea. So it is a personal mission of mine to help people understand that their idea of what is achievable is very distorted, and to give them some sort of level of media literacy so that they can look at, because I can't out individuals. I don't want to get sued.
It's up to you and me, Travis, to put photos of ourselves online as the litmus test.
I don't think anyone's thinking I'm steroids at all. I was just going to say you've mentioned it a few times, and I'm still trying to get my head around, what is insulin being used for?
They say it helps shuttle the nutrients into the muscles or something. So it always seems insulin is sometimes used by itself, but if human growth hormone is used, then insulin is definitely used. It's the triumvirate: steroids, human growth hormone, and insulin. Right. And they plan the peaks of insulin around their meals and things like this.
So it's sort of using pseudoscience that it helps the cells absorb the nutrients that they're taking on?
Yeah, I was trying to actually write a paper with an endocrinologist to evaluate the pseudoscience, but I've never actually seemed to manage to get that finished.
It just seems like a really dangerous, because I'm sitting there going, we always monitor it from patients who are on insulin for diabetes, and you sit there and just go, it's always a balancing act as to getting things right. But insulin, when it's taken, if it's just taken, you see that can be quite dangerous. You need to make sure you've got, It
is the only one of the image and performance enhancing drugs that they can kill themselves with, fast. Yeah. You can kill yourself slowly with steroids. Because people don't understand that the heart is a muscle and it doesn't selectively increase muscles. It increases muscles. And a big heart is not a good thing. Yeah. So insulin is interesting the way it is discussed in the community. There are some will say it's very dangerous, so I would never use it, and others say it's almost impossible to kill yourself with insulin as a bodybuilder, given the amount of food that we eat. And they will cite science. They cite a study of accidental insulin overdoses and how few of them actually died and things, but they will misuse the science. And I found that. So there was one guy in particular who made me really nervous about the bro scientists. Is he had a group, and they actually called themselves a cult, and they said we accept everything our leader says without question. And he finished school. He didn't even do a senior, I don't think. He's never been to college. But he reckons he can read and understand the science, and he tells them what to do and what to believe, and they listen. But I went and actually looked at the papers that he's saying say this, and I said, no, it doesn't actually say that. But they just listen to him. And this guy is scary because not only is he designing insulin protocols for bodybuilders and stuff, but he's telling them, oh, your dad who's a diabetic, I'll design his insulin protocol too.
Okay, yeah. Because
I actually know more than the medical establishment about these drugs. And if you combine it with, say, Himalayan pink salt and lots of tomatoes and do this and that, and they listen to this guy, it's really, really scary. Yeah. Anyway, I think personally that there has been numerous insulin deaths in recent years in bodybuilding. There have some that have been attributed to insulin. Often it's very hard to detect, but there's been numerous Dallas McCarver, Rich Piana, and various people whose deaths have been attributed to insulin. And I've had bodybuilders say that they've had mates found on their kitchen floor with insulin around them and that there are definitely bodybuilding deaths happening. Others are saying, no, insulin is safe as houses. This is why we need people to come in and evaluate this knowledge.
Yeah. Is there much more talk at all, or is it very small about all the side effects, about potentially unwanted but even harmful use or even long-term health issues?
There are. And look, I'm got to say, firstly, that I spoke to a certain type of image and performance enhancing drug user, because, I'm going into these places online that where these things are discussed, and I'm asking people to talk to me. I'm not paying them anything. So I was getting the guys who appreciate the social scientist in their midst, who appreciate science, who could see the potential benefit that I could have to their community. So I tended to get the more educated, risk-averse, what the literature has called the expert user. They read the science, they think things through very systematically, they design protocols systematically, so they might, I'll use this compound at this dose and see what happens, and then the next cycle I will either increase the dose or add another compound, but I would never do both because I want to know if the side effects change, what's causing it. I need to be able to control. So they're very systematic. There are other types of steroid users that say the YOLO users, the you only live once music festival goers that combine image and performance enhancing drugs with recreational drugs, which is very dangerous given the effect of steroids on the heart and things like this. They use the recreational drugs because they don't have the calories and stuff of like alcohol. Wow. So, but it's a dangerous cocktail. So there's people at different ends of the spectrum. I got hardly any YOLO users. As a result of being on SBS Insight, I had one guy who was a really reckless user, manufactured his own drugs, so he had no control. He could use as much as he wanted, and he had really significant mental health issues, and it was looking like the side effects were going to cost him his leg. And this is the only guy that I'd met who was really reckless. Most of the guys I talked to were very well educated and informed and systematic. So that premise, to my answer, what I found is people who designed their use in a way to minimize harm, so it's still effective use, they're still getting the muscular outcomes that they want, but they keep, doing baseline blood work before a cycle, doing the cycle, getting blood work done during the cycle to compare, tracking everything, monitoring their health, where possible, working with health professionals. So it was very considered use. But as I said, it varies, and there are risks. As I said before, body image can blind you to certain things. And I also think there is the normalization of certain harms. Like, I would ask steroid users, have you experienced any harms or side effects? And they go, no. And then later on they go, oh, yeah, well, look, I have no natural production of testosterone. But that wasn't considered a harm or a side effect. That was just a part of steroid use that was normalized, and like the potential for testosterone, exogenous testosterone needing to be used for the rest of their lives, that was just normalized. Wow. You told anyone outside of bodybuilding you might be dependent on a drug for the rest of your life, they'd go, oh my God, no way. In bodybuilding, sure, it's a price I'm willing to. I might never have children. I might never have my own testosterone back. Sure, it's a price I'm willing to pay. It's just normalized.
I think on that note, in closing, I wonder, Maya, reflecting back on your work, Is there any final advice? Are there any final thoughts that you would love to leave with doctors or patients who are listening in about steroids use?
Yes, there are. As I started this interview, there is this big disconnect that has existed for a long time between the medical community and scientific organisations on the one hand and the people that use the drugs on the other. Often the people who use the drugs have had bad experiences with medical professionals. Even if they haven't had them themselves, they've heard about these bad experiences. So they're often reluctant to divulge this use to a GP or an endocrinologist because they don't want to be shamed and they don't want to be told not to do it. Because as I said, often they've got a body image problem. And this is their solution. You can't take away their solution, because this is how they're coping. You can't take away their coping mechanism. So, they don't want you to take away their coping mechanism. So my advice is you will face preconceptions from people who use these drugs. Please don't tell them to stop. One, stopping straight out with no support and no health monitoring is dangerous for their mental health. Often they've got no natural testosterone. They're at high risk if they just stop in terms of suicide and things like this. They need support, need HCG, they need things like this. So don't just tell them to stop. Help them to monitor their health, understand the harms, to the best of your knowledge. As I said, there isn't much science to back you up. I've had a GP tell me that he actually helps them monitor their gains as well. Okay, look, you said you were taking this much because you were going to gain all this muscle and you didn't. Is it really worth you taking all of this stuff when you're not actually getting what you're looking for? He actually sort of observes them and talks to them, and it helps them to evaluate the risks versus the benefits of what they're doing. I don't know that every doctor's going to want to do that, but at the basis, don't tell them to stop. Don't overstate the harms. Of course, mention blood-borne virus, but don't overemphasize it. And admit when you don't know, because there isn't the science. And obviously, you've got to be honest and say, look, I honestly don't have an answer for you. I'll try and find one, or, it just isn't the science, and I'm sorry, I can't answer that question.
Dr. Maya Underwood, thank you very much for being part of This Medical Life.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Professor Ken Sakaris is a chemical pathologist and Director of Chemical Pathology at Dorevitch Pathology. Professor Sakaris is a NATA-accredited laboratory assessor, founding fellow of the RCPA Faculty of Science, and a principal examiner in pathology informatics. He's also a fellow of the Department of Pathology at the University of Melbourne. Professor Ken Sakaris is a regular guest on This Medical Life podcast and is returning in this episode, the second one we're doing on this topic. Ken, welcome back.
Thanks, Steve. To continue this discussion, I felt that there was some unfinished business.
Yes, I know. We cross our T's and we dot our I's. So let's get that process underway. How does anabolic steroid affect the body?
Anabolic steroids are synthetic androgens, mimic the action of testosterone. So they do everything that testosterone is meant to do, like improving muscle mass and encouraging hair growth. And so that's what people look for. But because it's synthetic, it has some other side effects, sort of uncontrolled side effects. And that includes effects on the liver because of, we don't completely understand how it affects the liver. It's sort of a mixture of both the anabolic effect as well as it's a synthetic drug. And so it can cause hepatitis. Because of its excessive androgen effects because it's harder to read when it's so potent. It'll have effects on behaviour, aggression, and irritability, and so on. It'll have an anabolic effect on tissues where you don't want an excessive effect, like the heart, hypertrophy of the heart and cardiomyopathy. An excessive effect on skin. So, like puberty, you'll get, acne and so on. So, it will mimic the impact of testosterone because it's so difficult to control, and often people think for that excessive impact. It will have extra physiological impacts, which are not really wanted.
What changes will anabolic steroids or like exogenous hormones do to the testosterone gonadotropin pathway?
Because they do have testosterone action, they'll operate in that feedback loop. They'll think that there's plenty of testosterone, so it will suppress LH and FSH production. FSH is controlled by inhibin feedback, but the levels of androgen are so high, even the FSH axis will be suppressed. And so LH and FSH suppressed means there's no stimulation for the testes. And so the testes won't be producing any natural testosterone, so the testosterone will be absent when you do it. There's no cross-reactivity, as we discussed before, between anabolics and testosterone. It will look like there's no testosterone because there's no testicular testosterone. And, if you did measure sperm counts and so on, they'd be very low to absent, like it's an effective suppression that the sperm counts can be zero presence of anabolic steroids.
What other tests or results are affected by steroids? So is this SHBG will be affected as well? Yes.
Now, SHBG, we said during the last session that one of the most clinically interesting aspects of SHBG is controlled by either insulin or hepatic production. But there are hormone feedbacks to SHBG production by the liver, and that includes testosterone, which suppress SHBG. Some of the lowest levels you'll ever see with SHBG are with anabolic steroid treatment. Whenever I see an SHBG below 10 micromole per litre, then I'm almost certain it's anabolic steroids. It's so convincing. And then the next thing that I look at to check whether it's anabolic is HDL cholesterol. HDL is low in anabolic steroid use, but it's like super low. The HDL levels will be like 0.2 or 0.3. A low HDL. I used to personally have a HDL of 0.8 or 0.9, which I read about. Well, 0.3 and 0.4 are like off the scale low. So, and it's actually something we can do in the laboratory. And I would recommend many GPs, if you want to check for anabolic steroid use, just look at the SHBG and HDL. They'll be really low. And disease doesn't do that.
Is PSA affected by anabolic steroids at all?
Well, it is. The cells that make PSA have testosterone receptors. And so just as in cancer therapy, when we withdraw testosterone, PSA by about 50%, if you give excessive amounts of testosterone, the PSA will increase because of increased production, not usually by 50%, but let's say 10%. But that's not, we shouldn't let that go lightly. The real concern with testosterone, excessive supraphysiological testosterone treatment, is that it will encourage neoplasia of the prostate. It's to do with the normal physiology. It's and I'll tell you that. I mean, we're allowed anecdotes when you're speaking to individual doctors. Just briefly, I had this was a court case I was involved. A man who had a testicular cancer. He had one testes removed and then irradiated his pelvis. Now, once you have irradiation of the pelvis, you're at risk of prostate cancer, as if you have a history. So you're now at risk of prostate cancer. Now, this man, even he had testosterone measurements and they were low-ish, but they weren't low. But he eventually doctor shopped until he found a GP who would give him testosterone. And now he was given testosterone. And 10 years later, he had metastatic aggressive prostate cancer, which I would date from not the time of the irradiation, that set up the predisposition, the time that he started supraphysiological testosterone. So that's the warning on every sort of testosterone supplementation. It should be the warning on every anabolic steroid that particularly if you're at risk of prostate cancer, if you've got supraphysiological levels of testosterone, you will recruit some cells into that cancer cell line. And so it's vitally important, vitally in the strongest sense of the word, that you monitor, say, if you're going to, not to look at the stimulation of the prostate, look for neoplasia, drastic increasing PSA. And that's the biggest risk for therapy in men. There are risks for cardiac disease. Apart from the hypertrophy of the heart, there's a risk of sclerotic disease. We're not quite sure how that happens. You could intuit say, well, if it drops HDL to virtually zero, and that's the good cholesterol, that works, but that's not how it works. Other patients, Tangier's disease and things where they lack HDL, what's complete, don't have these very, very high levels of atherosclerotic disease. There is a sort of not completely understood in atherosclerosis as well with supraphysiological therapy.
Is there any way to predict who will get side effects, like things like gynecomastia? Is that elevated estrogens or anything like that? Is there any way sort of to predict it?
Well, yes and no. So gynecomastia is thought to be like testosterone can be converted to estradiol from through the aromatase. So very high levels of testosterone will lead to high levels of estradiol, and so but then the tissue reactivity of breast tissue probably similar to women. So, breast enlargement are genetically determined as well as hormonally determined. So I don't think you can completely predict. You just run the risk of gynecomastia, the high testosterone you get.
Taking steroids, will that lead to long-term hormonal suppression though?
That's probably the most worrying thing and I mentioned that sperm counts can hit zero with anabolic steroid use. So when you stop them, it will take a while for the LH to come back up. It's been suppressed. But not only will it take a while for the LH to come up, which may be weeks or months, it might take months to a year or more sperm count to recover. And we really worry about, men with complete suppression of their testes for, months or years, whether their sperm will ever recover. And so that's really the big danger of, I think a lot of the gym junkies sort of aware of this. They do it intermittently because, constantly having those anabolic hormone. And I've got cases, hundreds of cases in our database, because we've got millions of patients in our database, of men whose sperm counts haven't recovered for years. So it short term you should predictably recover, but long term, it's as if an atrophy of testes cannot be reversed.
Now, you mentioned it before about cardiovascular disease and liver disease. Do we understand the mechanism behind steroids and these kind of, accelerated disease processes?
No, we don't. There's a lot of theories from why should testosterone affect the why should testosterone affect the liver, or why should anabolic steroids affect the liver? So it's something beyond just the androgen effect, the testosterone effect, and it's a little bit idiosyncratic, like a lot of drugs. Some men get severe liver disease as soon as they start anabolics, and some seem to affect that. So it's thought to be to do with the metabolism of anabolic in the liver that might cause a hepatitis. With the heart disease, the long-term use will lead to cardio hypertrophy and reverse and valvular dysfunction, lots of things like that. But the atherosclerotic increase with anabolic steroids can be superficially linked to the low HDL because HDL is very low, but that doesn't really explain. Low HDL on their own will not cause severe atherosclerotic disease. So it's a matter of intense research exactly how anabolic steroids cause liver disease, how they increase cardiovascular disease. It's absolutely certain that they do that. It's just the mechanism almost hypothetical at the moment because nobody's really proven any theories.
Now, let's assume that a patient is very open and honest with their doctor about taking steroids and saying, look, I am on steroids and I'm going to continue regardless of what the doctor says. Is there any important tests for doctors to do routinely for patients who are actually taking steroids?
Measuring PSA is really important for men because, many men will know with increased risk, family risk of prostate cancer, but don't know if they've got a family history. And so they shouldn't be, put at that risk. So I think that the prostate cancer thing is a very important one. As far as the cardiovascular thing is, if a patient's already got high cardiovascular risk, they're smokers, history of cardiovascular, then you really better double down on that cardiovascular risk and make sure you've assessed it, because otherwise you're ignoring a risk factor on top of risk factors that you already know. So, it's risky being involved in anybody with anabolic steroids, but when you know that that's going to exacerbate a clinical risk, then you better be very careful.
What about liver function tests? Would you do liver function, monitor liver function?
Yeah, you should. Yeah, you should liver function. The hepatitis is worrying in men. It very rarely can be fulminant, so it's worth checking that. And all of these things help to sort of convince a man that he's not doing the right thing.
It'd be a very brave doctor, though, to look up to this muscle-bound Hulk and say, naughty, naughty.
Now, if a doctor, doctor shopping and looking or seeking testosterone treatment that they may not need, how do you reckon, how should doctors navigate a situation where we can actually say, oh, this patient is actually seeking unnecessary treatment?
I don't know. I think you're into psychology rather than biochemistry here. But I think, like I said before, making sure you do the right test, because if a man goes to, if you measure testosterone often enough, you might get a level which is slightly low. One thing we haven't discussed, testosterone has a diurnal variation. So like all pituitary hormones, they're higher first thing in the morning. So if I was somebody who was doctor shopping testosterone, well, I would deliberately get tested at 4 or 5 in the afternoon, and then my testosterone level would be a bit low, and then my SHBG was also low for some reason. Well, then don't know that I didn't actually have a low testosterone. So might be misled. So, testing testosterone properly, which is in the morning, and measuring all of those other things, that the LH, HPG, all of those things are really important. Understand exactly what that what the impact of the anabolic is, or what the true androgen scenario physiology for that patient is. So, yeah, I know I'm from a private lab, and you might expect me to encourage more tests. But it's getting the complete picture.
As an outsider in the world of pathology, and I know you've got complexities already, but I would have thought tests like that would flag time of day test taken just as a little note to show likelihood of lower level, just for the person reading the test to be aware, or where do you stop?
Look, I'll tell you some truths, pathology collection. So our manuals say testosterone should be collected between 8 and 10. Any endocrinologist would tell you that, because in the afternoon you'll get results. But, when a patient turns up to a phlebotomy centre and, it's an afternoon, and so, we'll just do that, and the clinician will understand, taken in the afternoon and interpret it correctly, won't he? No. And we can't, and we don't have the complexity yet in the laboratory to sort of say, well, this is a reference interval for 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and this is a reference interval for 8 in the morning. So it is a bit.
Actually, you've been involved in some of the drug testing agencies and everything like that. Was that interesting?
Yes, there's, if I can be allowed another anecdote. So around the 2000, when we had the Olympics in Australia, we really up our national measurement laboratory in Sydney to be able to measure anabolic steroids. Piatkowski was the scientist in charge of that. Anyway, so men would want their screened for anabolic steroids or testosterone properly, and so on. And I had a sporting association come to me once, and they were after a sponsorship from a nutrition company, and the company said, we won't sponsor you unless you've shown clear of anabolic hormones. And it was like, well, that's easy to do. We've got a world-class laboratory in Sydney. So we contacted them and said, would you be able to test the elites of this sporting body? And so they did the tests. There was a field day, and they were all there. So they tested all of the competitors, and we sent it up there. And actually, Ray rang me back and he said, Ken, they're all positive. And so then I rang up the president of this sporting association. I said, the samples you sent us, they were all positive, including yours, the president. And his response was, wow, gee, that's very sensitive testing, or something like that. So he felt he got his money's worth in terms of a test, but I don't think they got the sponsorship. But yeah, it does show how prevalent, the use of anabolic steroids can be in sections of that sporting community.
The amazing thing for me is that testosterone, exogenous testosterone, does not show up on our normal assays, which means that we will actually not know from the test if they're taking it. We will just know the natural, which is sort of just news for me.
Yeah, oral and doesn't work because of first pass. So you give testosterone, natural, it just doesn't work. You can give it through the skin and very slowly, but you won't get super physiological levels usually that way. You can give it by depot injections. Now you can measure it. But the anabolics, which are aesthetics, we cannot measure.
Yeah. All right. For the record, you can feel my biceps there, Travis. That's all natural. That's blood, sweat and tears and a bit of creatine. Ken, any final advice or thoughts you've got on this topic for doctors or patients?
Only if you're going to test properly, get the free testosterone and the LH. You don't have to be shy about testing. If it's clinically necessary, do the test. And if you've done the right test, you'll be able to interpret them.
On that note, Professor Ken Sakaris, thank you again for joining us on This Medical Life.
Thanks.
This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts on social media. Dr. Travis Brown can be found on X. His username is @Dr. Travis Brown. That's Dr. Travis Brown. And Steve Davis can be found on LinkedIn. Go to linkedin.com/in/TheRealSteveDavis. This has been a PathNotes Proprietary Limited production.